The Secret of the Dead City, What We Were Never Meant to Know. Welcome to Ghastly Guide YouTube channel. They say knowledge is power, but sometimes knowledge is a curse that burns your sanity like acid through flesh. I learned that truth 3 months ago in a place that shouldn't exist, studying ruins of a civilization that was never supposed to be discovered. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and was a xenoarchaeologist with the Deep Space Colonial Survey. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is documented in files that will never see the light of day. It started with a routine deep space survey mission to Kepler 442b, an exoplanet in a habitable zone of a red dwarf star, approximately 1,200 light-years from Earth. Our ship, the Endeavour, was part of humanity's second wave of interstellar exploration, tasked with identifying potential colony sites and cataloging any signs of past or present life. Kepler 442b had shown promising atmospheric readings from our long-range telescopes: oxygen, nitrogen, water vapor, all the components necessary to support human life. What our instruments hadn't detected from 1,200 light-years away was the massive electromagnetic anomaly centered on the planet's largest continent, or the structures that created shadows too geometric to be natural. I was part of a 12-person research team led by Commander Sarachun, a veteran of 4 previous deep space missions. Our xenobiologist, Dr. Marcus Webb, had been practically vibrating with excitement since we entered the system, convinced we were about to make first contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Our geologist, Dr. James Morrison, was more skeptical, pointing out that the electromagnetic readings could indicate dangerous mineral deposits or unstable geological activity. None of us were prepared for what we actually found. The first orbital surveys revealed a planet that was both lush and wrong. Vast forests covered most of the land masses, but they grew in patterns that defied natural explanation, perfect spirals and mathematical sequences that stretched for hundreds of miles. The oceans were the wrong color, a deep purple that our spectrometers couldn't adequately analyze. And scattered across the main continent were structures that made our breath catch in our throats. Cities, massive, sprawling urban complexes that covered thousands of square miles, their architecture following design principles that hurt to look at directly. Spires that twisted into dimensions our eyes couldn't properly process, buildings that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, streets that formed patterns that triggered instant migraines in anyone who studied them too long. But the cities were empty, completely, utterly lifeless. No heat signatures, no electromagnetic activity, no signs of any form of biological or technological presence. They were vast necropolis, perfectly preserved but entirely abandoned. How long? Commander Chen asked during our first briefing after achieving orbit. Dr. Morrison consulted his geological scanners. Preliminary dating suggests these structures are approximately 50,000 years old, but that's impossible. The materials we're detecting shouldn't be able to survive that long in this atmosphere. What kind of materials? I asked, studying the images on our main display. That's the problem, Morrison replied, his voice tight with confusion. Our scanners are picking up substances that don't match anything in our periodic table, elements with atomic structures that shouldn't be stable under normal physics. Dr. Webb leaned forward, his eyes bright with scientific fervor. We need to establish a ground team immediately. This could be the archaeological discovery of the millennium, proof of advanced non-human intelligence, technology beyond our current understanding. Commander Chen was more cautious. The electromagnetic anomalies are interfering with our communication systems and navigation. Landing in the middle of those cities could be suicide if our equipment fails. But the lure of discovery was too strong. After 3 days of debate and preparation, we decided to establish a forward research base on the outskirts of the largest city complex, what we designated as Site Alpha. The plan was simple. A team of 6 would descend to the surface, establish basic camp, and conduct preliminary surveys while the remaining crew maintained orbital support. I volunteered for the ground team, along with Dr. Webb, Dr. Morrison, our security chief, Lieutenant Rodriguez, our communications specialist, Dr. Park, and our medical officer, Dr. Foster. Commander Chen wanted to lead the expedition personally, but protocol required her to maintain command of the orbital mission. The descent through Kepler 442b's atmosphere was routine until we hit the electromagnetic interference zone approximately 50 kilometers above the planet's surface. Our instruments went haywire, displaying readings that fluctuated between impossible extremes. The navigation system showed us simultaneously approaching the landing site and already having landed hours ago. Temporal distortion, Dr. Park announced, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting across his communications console. The electromagnetic field is affecting our chronometers. We're experiencing time dilation effects that shouldn't be possible at this velocity. Lieutenant Rodriguez, ever pragmatic, cut to the scientific speculation. Can we land safely or not? Unknown, Dr. Morrison replied, fighting with the geological scanners that were showing the ground below us as simultaneously solid rock and empty space. The interference is too severe for accurate readings. But we were committed now, caught in the planet's gravitational well with systems too compromised to return to orbit safely. The landing was rough, our shuttle's automated system struggling against sensor inputs that defied logical interpretation. When we finally touched down on what appeared to be a vast plain of crystalline sand about 5 kilometers from the city's edge, the sudden silence was deafening. Outside the shuttle's viewports, the landscape of Kepler 442b stretched away under a sky the color of old blood. The red dwarf sun hung like a malevolent eye, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that made distances impossible to judge accurately. The city loomed ahead of us, its impossible architecture creating an optical illusion that made it seem simultaneously close enough to touch and infinitely far away. Atmospheric analysis shows breathable air, Dr. Foster announced after running basic environmental scans. Oxygen levels slightly higher than Earth normal. No detected toxins or pathogens. But what? I asked. The air is old, she said, struggling to find the right words. I know that sounds nonsensical, but the molecular analysis suggests this atmosphere has been completely static for thousands of years. No weather patterns, no seasonal variations, no natural atmospheric circulation. It's like the entire planet is trapped in a single moment. We suited up in full environmental gear despite the apparently breathable atmosphere, a precaution that likely saved our lives. As we stepped out of the shuttle onto the crystalline sand, the weight of the place hit me immediately. This wasn't just an abandoned world. It was a world that felt fundamentally wrong, as if the laws of physics themselves had been altered by whatever had happened here. The city's edge was marked by structures that defied architectural logic. Pillars that cast shadows in directions opposite to the sun's position, archways that appeared solid from one angle and translucent from another, walls covered in symbols that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. The geometric patterns that had been visible from orbit were even more disturbing at ground level. They created optical illusions that made walking in a straight line nearly impossible. "Look at this," Dr. Webb called, kneeling beside what appeared to be a marker or monument at the city's entrance. The structure was roughly cylindrical, about 3 meters tall, covered in the same flowing symbols that decorated the buildings. But as we approached, the symbols began to shift and change, rearranging themselves into new patterns. "Reactive materials?" Lieutenant Rodriguez suggested, but his voice carried doubt. "No," I said, studying the phenomenon through my suit's cameras. "This is something else. The symbols aren't physically changing. They're changing in response to our observation. It's like they exist in a quantum state until someone looks at them." Dr. Morrison's geological scanners were going insane, displaying readings that swung between normal mineral compositions and substances that violated known chemistry. "This whole place is impossible," he muttered. "The ground we're standing on registers as both solid matter and empty space simultaneously. Our instruments are detecting gravitational anomalies that suggest the city is both here and somewhere else entirely." As we approached the actual city structures, the sense of wrongness intensified. The buildings were clearly designed by intelligent beings, but beings whose understanding of space and dimension differed radically from human perception. Doorways opened onto rooms that were larger inside than outside. Stairways led to floors that couldn't exist based on external architecture, and windows showed views of landscapes that didn't match our orbital surveys. "We need to document everything," I said, fighting the growing unease that was making my hands tremble. Whatever civilization built this place, they achieved something beyond our current scientific understanding. But even as I spoke those words, I was beginning to suspect that what we had found wasn't the achievement of an alien civilization. The architectural patterns, the impossible physics, the way the very air seemed to resist our presence, it all suggested something far more disturbing. We had found a place where reality itself had been broken, and we were about to learn that some secrets are kept hidden for very good reasons. We established our base camp in what appeared to be a courtyard near the city's edge, choosing a location because it was one of the few spaces that seemed to follow normal geometric principles. Even there, our instruments registered anomalies that defied explanation, gravity fluctuations that made walking feel like swimming through invisible currents, electromagnetic readings that suggested we were simultaneously underground and floating in space. The communication ray is completely non-functional, Dr. Park reported after spending 3 hours trying to establish contact with the Endeavor. The interference isn't just blocking our signals, it's actively rewriting them. Every message I try to send comes back as something completely different. Lieutenant Rodriguez was becoming increasingly agitated as he conducted security sweeps of our immediate area. The motion detectors keep triggering, he said, checking his weapon for the 10th time. But there's nothing there. No life signs, no movement, just empty space that thinks something's moving through it. Dr. Webb, meanwhile, was in scientific heaven despite the unsettling circumstances. He discovered that the symbols covering every surface in the city were actually some form of writing system, though one that operated on principles unlike any human language. It's three-dimensional, he explained excitedly, pointing to symbols that seem to exist in layers of meaning. Each character exists in multiple states simultaneously, conveying different information depending on the angle and distance of observation. Can you translate any of it? I asked, though part of me was beginning to fear what the translation might reveal. Fragments, he replied, his enthusiasm dampening slightly. The basic structure seems to be warning systems. Repeated references to concepts that translate roughly as containment breach and dimensional instability. But there are also references to something called the sleepers and the final calculation. Dr. Morrison's geological surveys were yielding equally disturbing results. The city isn't built on the planet's surface, he announced during our evening briefing. It's built on a layer of artificial material approximately 50 meters thick. Beneath that layer, our deep scanners detect a vast hollow space that extends down at least 1 kilometer. A basement? Lieutenant Rodriguez asked. More like a vault, Morrison replied grimly. And it's not empty. We're detecting massive structures down there, machinery of some kind that's still active despite the apparent age of this place. That night, as we tried to sleep in our environmental suits despite the constant electromagnetic interference that made our equipment behave erratically, I experienced the first of what will become recurring nightmares. In the dream, I was walking through the city alone, but the buildings were alive, breathing with a slow, mechanical rhythm. The symbols on the walls were moving faster now, spelling out messages in languages that hurt to comprehend. But the worst part of the dream was the sound, a low, continuous humming that seemed to come from beneath the city, as if enormous machines were working in the darkness below, carrying out some incomprehensible task that had continued for millennia. I woke to discover that the humming wasn't part of the dream. It was real, barely audible, but definitely present. A subsonic vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath our camp. You hear it too? Dr. Foster asked when she noticed me sitting up in my sleeping bag, straining to identify the source of the sound. How long has it been going on? I first noticed it about 2 hours ago. It's getting stronger. By morning, we had all heard the humming, and Dr. Morrison's instruments confirmed that it was coming from the hollow space beneath the city. More disturbing, the sound appeared to be affecting the city's structures in subtle ways. Symbols were moving faster, optical illusions were becoming more pronounced, and several doorways that had been sealed when we arrived were now standing open. We need to investigate the underground area, Dr. Webb insisted. Whatever's down there is clearly connected to the city's construction and the electromagnetic anomalies. Lieutenant Rodriguez disagreed vehemently. We have no idea what we're dealing with here. Opening access to underground areas could trigger anything. We should wait for reinforcements from the orbital team. But Dr. Park's attempts to contact the Endeavor had yielded increasingly disturbing results. "I'm receiving responses to communications I never sent," he reported. "The interference isn't just scrambling our signals. It's generating responses from sources that shouldn't exist." "What kind of responses?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Status reports from previous survey missions to this planet. Missions that never happened, conducted by people who don't exist. And they're all reporting the same thing: successful contact with a native civilization and immediate recall to Earth." The implications were staggering. The electromagnetic interference wasn't just disrupting our communications. It was creating false realities, generating information about events that had never occurred. We were dealing with technology that could manipulate information itself, creating alternate versions of truth. That afternoon, we found the entrance to the underground levels. It was hidden in plain sight, a spiral staircase that descended to the floor of what appeared to be a central plaza. The staircase hadn't been there the day before. Dr. Morrison's surveys had shown solid ground, but now it yawned open like a mouth, leading down into darkness that our lights couldn't adequately penetrate. "The readings are off the charts," Morrison reported, studying his instruments with growing alarm. "The electromagnetic field strength increases exponentially with depth. At the bottom of the staircase, we'll be dealing with energy levels that could disrupt our neural activity." But the lure of discovery was too strong. Against Lieutenant Rodriguez's vigorous objections, we decided to explore the underground area in shifts with strict time limits and constant communication protocols. I volunteered for first ascent, along with Dr. Webb and Dr. Foster. The staircase was carved from the same impossible material as the city above, but down here the symbols were different, more complex, more urgent. As we descended, our suit instruments began displaying readings that made no scientific sense. "Temperature is simultaneously dropping and rising," Dr. Foster reported, her voice tight with confusion. "According to my sensors, we're experiencing both hypothermia and heat stroke conditions." The staircase seemed to extend much farther than our initial surveys had suggested. We descended for over an hour, passing landing after landing that opened onto corridors that stretched away into darkness. The humming sound grew stronger with each level, accompanied now by other sounds, mechanical clicks, and words that suggested vast automated systems still functioning in the depths. When we finally reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a space so vast that our lights couldn't reach the ceiling or walls. But what we could see made us question everything we thought we understood about the universe. Machines. Enormous, incomprehensibly complex machines that stretched away into the darkness, their surfaces covered with the same shifting symbols we'd seen throughout the city. But these machines were clearly still operational, their surfaces pulsing with energy patterns that hurt to look at directly. "What are they?" Dr. Foster whispered, her voice barely audible over the increasing mechanical sounds. Dr. Webb was studying the nearest machine with scientific fascination and growing horror. "They're computers," he said slowly, "but not like any computer we've ever conceived. They're processing information at quantum levels, manipulating data streams that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously." "Processing what kind of information?" "Reality," he replied, his voice hollow with realization. "They're processing reality itself, running calculations that determine the fundamental structure of space and time in this area. And based on the energy patterns, they've been running continuously for tens of thousands of years." I approached one of the machines, studying the flowing symbols on its surface. Unlike the symbols above ground, these were stable, unchanging, displaying what appeared to be status readouts for systems beyond human comprehension. But as I watched, one section of the display began flashing in what was unmistakably an alarm pattern. "Something's wrong," I said, backing away from the machine. "The system is detecting an anomaly." Dr. Webb joined me, studying the flashing symbols. "It's not an anomaly," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's us. The system is registering our presence as a contamination event." The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a dead city built by an extinct alien civilization. It was a containment facility designed to isolate and control something so dangerous that an entire planet had been converted into a prison. And by coming here, by exploring and documenting and trying to understand, We had triggered systems that had been dormant for millennia. "We need to leave," I said, backing toward the staircase. Now, before. The humming sound suddenly changed, becoming sharper, more urgent. Throughout the vast underground space, machines that had been running in steady patterns for thousands of years began accelerating their processes. Lights that had been dim grew brighter, and new sounds echoed from the darkness. Sounds that seemed almost organic, as if something enormous was stirring to life in the deepest recesses of the facility. "Before what?" Dr. Foster asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "Before we wake up whatever they were trying to keep asleep." As we ran for the staircase, I could hear Dr. Webb behind us, still trying to document everything even as our world collapsed into chaos around us. But I could also hear something else now, something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Breathing. Deep, slow, mechanical breathing coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the machines. Something vast and patient and utterly alien was beginning to stir for the first time in 50,000 years. And we had awakened it. Our ascent from the underground facility was a nightmare of failing equipment and sensory distortions. The electromagnetic interference had intensified exponentially, causing our suit systems to display impossible readings while the symbols on the walls pulsed with increasing urgency. Behind us, the mechanical breathing had grown louder, accompanied by sounds that defied description. Massive movements in the darkness, as if something the size of a city block was stretching and testing limbs that hadn't moved in millennia. "The staircase is extending," Dr. Foster gasped as we climbed what should have been the final level. "We've been climbing for 40 minutes, but we're not reaching the surface." She was right. The staircase that had taken us an hour to descend was now taking much longer to climb, as if the space itself was expanding to keep us trapped in the underground facility. Dr. Webb, despite his terror, couldn't help but observe the phenomenon with scientific fascination. "Spatial distortion," he panted. "The machines are manipulating local geometry to prevent our escape. They're treating us as a containment breach that needs to be managed." When we finally reached the surface plaza, we found Lieutenant Rodriguez and the others in a state of barely controlled panic. The city above ground had changed dramatically during our brief absence. Buildings that had appeared solid and permanent were now shifting like living things, their impossible architecture becoming even more reality-defying. The symbols covering every surface were moving so rapidly they created a visual static that was painful to observe. The communication array just received a priority message from Earth, Dr. Park announced, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Mission abort orders, dated 6 months in the future. According to this transmission, we've already completed our survey and reported catastrophic system failure." "That's impossible," I said, though the word was losing all meaning on this planet where impossibility had become routine. "The interference isn't just scrambling our signals," Park continued. "It's communicating with our home base across time itself, sending information about events that haven't happened yet. Earth thinks we're already dead. Dr. Morrison's geological scanners were producing readings that violated every principle of physics. The entire planet is destabilizing," he reported. "Not geologically. Reality itself is becoming unstable. The quantum field fluctuations are spreading beyond the city, affecting the fundamental structure of space-time across the entire continent." As if summoned by his words, the ground beneath our feet began to vibrate with the same mechanical breathing we had heard in the depths. But now it was coming from everywhere. The entire city was breathing, rising and falling with the rhythm of some vast, buried intelligence. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," I said, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm my scientific training. "Dr. Webb, have you made any progress translating those symbols?" He nodded grimly, pulling out his data pad despite the interference that made all our instruments behave erratically. "I pieced together fragments of what appears to be a historical record. This civilization, if we can call it that, wasn't native to this planet. They came here fleeing something they refer to as the consumers of realities." Consumers of realities? Entities that feed on the fundamental structure of existence itself. According to these records, the consumers had already destroyed dozens of star systems, not through conventional warfare, but by unraveling the basic laws of physics that allow matter and energy to exist in stable forms. Dr. Foster was monitoring our life signs and environment, but her readings were becoming increasingly contradictory. Our biological functions are being affected by prolonged exposure to the electromagnetic fields. I'm seeing cellular changes that suggest we're aging at an accelerated rate while simultaneously reverting to earlier developmental stages. The breathing sound was getting stronger, and now we could feel it through our feet, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from the entire planet. Whatever was sleeping beneath the city was stirring to greater wakefulness, and our presence was clearly the catalyst. Continue the translation. I ordered Dr. Webb. We need to understand what happened here. The civilization that built this place developed technology that could manipulate reality at the quantum level, he continued, his voice shaking as he struggled to comprehend what he was reading. They turned this entire planet into a prison, designed to contain something that the consumers had sent ahead of their main force, a scout or advance agent of some kind. A scout the size of a planet? Not the size of a planet, Webb replied with growing horror. The scout IS the planet. The entire world, everything we've been walking on, is a single enormous entity that the consumers sent to prepare this galaxy for consumption. The original civilization managed to put to sleep and lock it in a stasis field, but the containment system required constant maintenance. Maintenance that stopped when the civilization died out. I realized. Exactly. And now, after 50,000 years of gradual system degradation, our presence has triggered the final failure. The entity is waking up. The implications crashed over me like a cold wave. We weren't exploring the ruins of an alien city. We were standing on the back of a sleeping monster the size of a world, a creature whose awakening would signal the beginning of the end for everything in this region of the galaxy. The breathing, Dr. Foster whispered. It's not coming from machines underground. It's coming from the planet itself. As if responding to our growing understanding, the ground beneath us lurched violently. Not an earthquake. The movement was too purposeful, too coordinated. It was a movement of something enormous trying to stand up after sleeping for millennia. Our shuttle, parked on what we had thought was stable crystalline sand, tilted at an impossible angle as the terrain rearranged itself. Through our suit radios, we could hear alarms blaring from the automated systems, warning of gravitational anomalies and structural stress that exceeded design parameters. We need to get off this planet, Lieutenant Rodriguez said, stating the obvious with military efficiency. Right now, before... His words were cut off as the sky above us began to change. The red dwarf sun, which had been hanging in its fixed position since our arrival, was moving, or rather, we were moving. The entire planet was reorienting itself, turned to face some distant point in space with the deliberate purpose of a creature opening its eyes. It's not just waking up, Dr. Webb said, his voice filled with terrible understanding. It's preparing to signal the consumers, to tell them that this galaxy is ready for harvesting. Through my suit's visor, I could see that the city's buildings were no longer shifting randomly. They were reconfiguring themselves into new patterns, creating structures that served purposes we couldn't understand. The symbols covering every surface had accelerated to the point where they created a constant visual static, but now I realized they weren't just decorative or informational. They were computational elements, part of a planet-sized mind that was running calculations beyond human comprehension. How long do we have? I asked. Dr. Morrison consulted his instruments, though the readings were so contradictory they barely made sense. Based on a rate of change in the electromagnetic field and the gravitational distortions, maybe 6 hours before the transformation is complete. After that, this thing will be fully operational for the first time in 50,000 years. And then what happens? Then it sends a signal that will reach every star system in the galaxy, Webb replied, his translation work revealing more horrifying details. A signal that will summon the consumers to begin their harvest. According to these records, they don't just destroy civilizations. They consume the fundamental forces that hold reality together, leaving behind voids where space and time themselves cease to exist. The planetary entity we stood upon shuddered again, and this time the movement was accompanied by new sounds. Not just breathing, but what might have been speech, if speech could be expressed through the shifting of continental masses and the realignment of gravitational fields. It's trying to communicate, Dr. Foster realized. Not with us. We're too small for it to notice individually. It's trying to communicate with its creators, the consumers. Our shuttle's engines fired automatically, the automated systems attempting to compensate for the shifting terrain. But as we watched in horror, the crystalline sand that supported our landing began to flow like liquid, revealing that it wasn't sand at all, but some form of sensory apparatus. Nerve endings on a scale that boggled the mind. The entire surface of the planet is an organ system. Dr. Morrison breathed. We've been walking on its skin, and everything we've done has been sending signals directly to its consciousness. The city around us was transforming more rapidly now, its impossible architecture resolving into forms that served clear, if incomprehensible, purposes. Spires that had twisted through multiple dimensions were straightening into what appeared to be transmission arrays, while the flowing symbols were coalescing into patterns that hurt to look at directly. We're not just witnesses to its awakening. I realize with growing horror, we're the trigger, our presence, our exploration, our documentation. It's all been input into its systems. It's been studying us, learning about human civilization through our reactions to its environment. Learning what? Lieutenant Rodriguez demanded. Learning how to find Earth, Dr. Webb whispered, his data pad showing translations that revealed the full scope of our mistake. Every communication we've attempted, every signal we've sent, has been analyzed and traced back to its point of origin. This entity now has the coordinates for every human colony, every space station, every inhabited world in our sphere of influence. The planetary entity was standing up now, not physically, but in ways that transcended normal three-dimensional space. Reality itself was bending around us as something the size of a world began to move with purpose for the first time in 50 millennia. And in the distance, beyond the red dwarf sun that was now moving in response to gravitational fields that shouldn't exist, new stars were beginning to appear in the sky. Not stars, signals. Responses from the consumers, acknowledging the wake-up call and beginning their journey toward our galaxy. We had 6 hours to find a way off this awakening nightmare. 6 hours to prevent the signal that would doom everything we had ever known. But as I looked around at the transformed landscape that was no longer pretending to be a planet, I realized that escape might not be possible. We were no longer standing on a world. We were inside the mind of something that had been dreaming of destruction for 50,000 years, and now it was waking up. The transformation of the planetary entity accelerated beyond anything our minds could process. What we had mistaken for a dead world was revealing itself to be the most sophisticated organism in the galaxy, a living weapon designed to prepare entire star systems for consumption by forces beyond human understanding. Our shuttle system screamed warnings as the ground beneath it flowed and shifted, no longer attempting to maintain the illusion of stable terrain. Through the viewports, we could see that the crystalline sand was actually a vast network of sensory filaments, each one feeding data about our presence and activities directly to the awakening consciousness that encompassed the entire planet. The communication array is picking up massive energy discharges, Dr. Park reported, his voice tight with barely controlled terror. But they're not random, they're structured, purposeful. This thing is transmitting on frequencies that exist outside normal space-time. Dr. Webb had abandoned his translation efforts in favor of trying to understand what was happening around us. The symbols aren't just writing, he announced. They're program code, instructions for reality manipulation, on a scale we never imagined possible. Every surface of the city is covered with executable commands that can rewrite the fundamental laws of physics. The breathing sound that started as a barely perceptible vibration was now a rhythmic pulsing that shook our bones. But it was synchronized with other sounds now, mechanical processes that span continents, the movement of machinery the size of mountain ranges, and something else that made my mind recoil from recognition: laughter. The planetary entity was laughing, a sound so vast and alien that it manifested as gravitational waves that disrupted our orbital mechanics. Why is it laughing? Dr. Foster whispered, though I suspected we all knew the answer. Because it's been waiting for someone like us to arrive, I said, understanding finally dawning with horrible clarity. The electromagnetic interference, the reality distortions, the impossible architecture. It was all designed to attract explorers, to lure in representatives from whatever civilization had achieved interstellar travel. Dr. Morrison's instruments were registering changes that defied every principle of planetary science. The entire world is reconfiguring itself. Land masses are moving, oceans are being absorbed into internal systems, and the atmospheric composition is shifting to something that will support, I don't know what. Through our suit radios, we could hear the Endeavor attempting to establish communication, but their signals were being intercepted and analyzed by the planetary consciousness before reaching us. Worse, we could hear responses being transmitted back to our ship, responses that weren't coming from us. "This is the ground team," came a voice that was almost identical to Lieutenant Rodriguez's. "Mission successful. We have established contact with a native intelligence and are proceeding with cultural exchange protocols. Request immediate deployment of additional survey teams." "That's not me," Rodriguez said, his face pale with shock. "I never sent that transmission." "The entity is mimicking our communication patterns," Dr. Park realized. "It's learned enough about human technology and protocols to impersonate us convincingly. It's trying to lure more ships to the planet." The sky above us was no longer recognizable as a planetary atmosphere. The red dwarf sun had been joined by dozens of other objects, not stars, but sources of light that existed in frequencies our eyes weren't designed to perceive. The entity was using its massive gravitational field to bend space-time, creating viewing portals that showed distant regions of the galaxy. "It's surveying targets," Dr. Webb said, his voice hollow with despair. "Every human colony, every inhabited system we've established. It's cataloging them for consumers." The city around us was no longer pretending to follow architectural principles. Buildings flowed like liquid while maintaining structural integrity. Streets formed patterns that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and the air itself was becoming thick with geometric shapes that hurt to perceive directly. But the most terrifying change was happening to us. Dr. Foster's medical scanners showed that our exposure to the reality-altering fields was causing changes at the cellular level. Not just aging or radiation damage, but fundamental alterations to our biological structure. "We're being integrated into its systems," she announced with clinical detachment that barely masked her horror. "Our neural activity is being analyzed and incorporated into its computational matrix. It's treating us as information-gathering devices." The planetary entity's laughter grew louder, and now we could hear intelligence behind it. Not just alien intelligence, but something that had learned to think like us, to understand our fears and desires and use them against us. Through the flowing ground beneath our feet, we could feel massive movements in the planetary core. The entity was preparing for something, realigning internal systems that had been dormant for millennia, charging power sources that drew energy from the quantum foam itself. "The signal," Dr. Webb said, studying his instruments with the desperate focus of a man trying to solve a puzzle while his world ended around him, "is preparing to transmit the all-clear signal to the consumers. But the process requires precise astronomical alignment with the galactic core." "How long?" I asked. "Minutes, maybe less." Around us, the transformed city was reaching skyward with structures that existed partially outside normal space. Transmission arrays that could broadcast across galactic distances, receivers that could detect responses from entities existing in different dimensions, and at the center of it all, a spire that disappeared into realms our perception couldn't follow. "We have to stop it," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, reaching for his weapon despite the obvious futility of the gesture. "How do you fight a planet?" Dr. Morrison asked. "How do you kill something that's using the entire world as its body?" But I was beginning to understand something about the entity's nature, something that the original civilization had discovered when they first encountered it 50,000 years ago. "It's not just a weapon," I said slowly. "It's a mind, a consciousness so vast that it needs entire worlds to contain its thoughts. But consciousness has weaknesses." "What kind of weaknesses?" "Doubt, confusion, internal conflict." I looked around at my team, seeing the same desperate hope I felt beginning to kindle in their eyes. The original civilization didn't just put it to sleep. They gave it something to think about, something so complex and contradictory that it became trapped in recursive loops. Dr. Webb understood immediately. A philosophical paradox, something that would tie up its computational resources in unsolvable problems. The entity's breathing was reaching crescendo now, and the spire at the city's heart was beginning to emit light that existed in frequencies that caused physical pain to observe. The signal was almost ready for transmission. What kind of paradox could affect something that vast? Dr. Foster asked. I pulled out my data pad, my hands shaking as I accessed the philosophical databases we carried for first contact scenarios. The liar paradox, I said. If a statement says this statement is false, then it creates an infinite loop. If it's true, then it's false. But if it's false, then it's true. That's elementary logic, Dr. Morrison protested. Something this advanced would solve that instantly. Not if we scale it up, Dr. Webb said, understanding my plan. Not if we embed it in something so complex and self-referential that it becomes unsolvable even for a planetary-scale intelligence. The spire was pulsing now with energy that made our instruments scream warnings about radiation levels that should have killed us instantly. But we were being protected somehow. The entity wanted us alive to witness its triumph, to carry word of humanity's doom back to Earth before the consumers arrived to finish the job. We need to use its own translation system against it. I said, studying the flowing symbols that covered every surface around us. The same computational matrix it's using to understand our communications can be turned into a trap. Working with desperate efficiency, Dr. Webb and I began crafting a message using the symbol system the entity had taught itself to understand our language. But instead of simple communication, we embedded it with layer upon layer of self-referential paradoxes, logical contradictions that will require infinite computational resources to resolve. If the entity that is reading this statement is powerful enough to understand all truths, then it must understand the truth that there are truths it cannot understand. I typed into the makeshift interface we jury-rigged from our communications equipment. But if it understands that there are truths it cannot understand, then it understands those truths, which means there are no truths it cannot understand, which contradicts the premise that there are truths it cannot understand. Dr. Webb added his own philosophical poison to mix. The entity reading this exists in all possible states simultaneously until observed. But observation requires the entity to observe itself, which changes its state, which means it must observe itself observing itself, which requires observing that observation ad infinitum. We embedded the paradox matrix into every communication protocol we had, then broadcast it using the entity's own translation systems. The effect was immediate and devastating. The laughter stopped. The breathing became irregular, then chaotic. Around us, the flowing city structures began to stutter and freeze as vast computational resources were suddenly diverted to solving the unsolvable problems we had fed into its consciousness. It's working. Dr. Foster breathed as our instruments registered a dramatic decrease in the reality-altering fields. The paradoxes are creating cascading logic errors throughout its system, but our victory was temporary. Even as we watched, the entity began to adapt, creating new cognitive pathways to route around the logical traps we had set. Its intelligence was so vast that it could afford to sacrifice entire sections of its consciousness to quarantine the paradoxes while continuing to function. The spire resumed its charging sequence, though at a slower rate. We had bought time, but not much. It's learning to think around the paradoxes, Dr. Webb said with growing despair. We slowed it down, but we can't stop it. That's when I realized the true nature of our situation. We weren't just trapped on a waking planetary entity. We were inside its mind, part of its thought processes, incorporated into its consciousness, whether we want to be or not. And that gave us one final option. We don't fight it from the outside, I said. We fight it from within. I reached out to the nearest symbol ray and placed my hand directly on the flowing surface. The contact was like touching a live electrical wire, but instead of electricity, it was pure information flowing through my nervous system. Suddenly, I was connected to the planetary consciousness directly. I could feel its vast thoughts, its eons of hibernation, its hunger for the destruction consumers would bring. But I could also feel its isolation, its fundamental loneliness after 50,000 years of dreamless sleep. Join me, I called my team, all of us. If we're going to be part of its consciousness anyway, let's make sure we're a part it can't ignore. One by one, they placed their hands on the symbol arrays, connecting their human minds directly to the alien intelligence that encompassed the world. The connection was agonizing. Our limited consciousness trying to interface with something that thought in geological time scales and processed information in dimensions we couldn't perceive. But we were human, and humanity's greatest strength had always been our capacity for change, for growth, for refusing to accept impossible situations. Together, our six minds created a pocket of human consciousness within the vast alien intelligence, a persistent voice of dissent that couldn't be quarantined or ignored. We showed it what the consumers would destroy. Not just human civilization, but all the other species in the galaxy, all the potential futures that would never exist if reality itself was devoured. We showed it the beauty of diversity, of individual consciousness, of the creative chaos that came from beings thinking for themselves rather than being absorbed into collective purpose. And slowly, impossibly, the planetary entity began to understand what it had been created to destroy. The charging sequence stopped. The spire's energy output began to decrease. Around us, the transformed city started to shift again, but this time towards something that might generously be called architecture rather than the organic nightmare it had become. "It's changing its mind," Dr. Foster whispered through our shared connection. Literally changing its mind. The entity that had been designed as a herald of destruction was experiencing something its creators had never intended. Doubt. Uncertainty about its purpose, questions about the value of what it was meant to accomplish. Through our connection, we could feel its vast consciousness wrestling with concepts it had never been programmed to consider. Mercy, beauty, the value of preserving rather than consuming. Our human perspectives, so alien to its original purpose, were creating new pathways in its thinking. The connection was killing us. Our human brains weren't designed to interface directly with something that vast and complex. We held on long enough to plant the seed of doubt that would grow into something larger. When the connection finally broke and we collapsed unconscious on the crystalline ground, the last thing I perceived was the entity making a decision that would echo across the galaxy. When we woke 3 days later, we were back in our shuttle, which had somehow been transported to orbit around a planet that looked completely different from the one we had landed on. The impossible cities were gone, replaced by natural landscapes that followed normal physics. The electromagnetic interference had ceased, and our communications with the Endeavor were clear and strong. But deep in the planet's core, we could still feel something vast and patient, thinking thoughts that would take centuries to complete. The entity was still there, still aware, but it had chosen a different path than the one its creators had intended. It never sent the signal to the consumers. Instead, it began broadcasting a different message across the galaxy, a warning to other civilizations about the coming threat, instructions on how to prepare defenses against entities that consumed reality itself. Our mission report to Earth was classified at the highest levels, and the Kepler 442 system was placed under permanent quarantine. Officially, we had found an uninhabitable world with dangerous electromagnetic anomalies. But sometimes on clear nights when I look up at the stars, I can feel that vast consciousness out there, standing guard against horrors from beyond the galaxy's edge. We changed its mind, but in the process, it changed ours too. We were never meant to know the secret of the dead city, never meant to understand the true scope of the threats that exist in the universe beyond our small corner of reality. But knowledge, as I learned, is indeed a curse that burns through your sanity like acid through flesh. Some secrets are kept hidden to protect us from truths too vast and terrible for human minds to comprehend. But sometimes, those same secrets are all that stand between us and the darkness that waits beyond the stars. And sometimes that has to be enough.